In almost every genre that you can think of, there are artists who help define what that genre sounds like. For smaller genres like IDM, you have guys like Aphex Twin and Autechre. For post-rock, Godspeed You, Black Emperor, and Swans. But what a lot of people tend to forget is that, arguably as important as the artists themselves, it's the labels that compile and curate a sound which helps define an aesthetic. Especially today, when there are so many different subgenres with different artists trying to stand out from the pack, it's the label's job to be a home for those artists and to build a sound that listeners can come to over and over again. And there is a label that did just that for the Vaporwave scene. The label that built and created the sound and aesthetic that we all know of today, and then seemingly out of nowhere, vanished. Let's talk about Beer on the Rug. Alright, now before we get into what made Beer on the Rug so special and the seminal albums they would release over their tenure, we need to delve into their beginnings. Now, at the time, Vaporwave was something completely different from what it is today. Its aesthetics were just starting to get off the ground thanks to the efforts of guys like James Ferraro and Monotrix Point Never. But they could only do so much given their position as high-profile artists. And as the nature of the genre relies so much on sampling copyrighted material, it would be too much of a risk for them to continue with the genre. So at the end of the day, it was really left to the underground music scene to take the mantle and continue where Ferraro and Lopatin left off. Immediately we saw artists pop out from out of nowhere, and though they might not have known it yet, these artists were collectively adding towards an aesthetic which would define Vaporwave in later years. The likes of Internet Club, 18 Karat Affair, Skeleton, and so many others. And while this explosion in artistic expression was going on, two artists were taking notice. Gorav Bashyakharov and Josh Thomas. Now, these two were behind the alias of Cults, an ambient experimental electronic group. But in 2010, they fell in love with the movement that was happening online, and along with adding to that movement with their own music, they went a step further and created their own label, Beer on the Rug. Now, besides the oddly cool name that they chose for a label, there weren't too many labels at the time who were putting out Vaporwave materials. So when this label popped up, people were intrigued by the idea of what they were doing, releasing cassettes and albums that were all seemingly sampled from commercial or commercial music. The first album they put out, which would start to get some traction online, would be the self-titled Midnight Television. To many who are involved with the genre, this album is an underrated classic, one who kind of flew under the radar for most of Vaporwave's history, mainly because it just wasn't the right time yet for Vaporwave to explode. Regardless though, the album did gain some attention online, and personally, I can see why. This album, despite it being short, is smooth as hell and really nails down the source material to a T, delving into a smooth commercialized aesthetic with a lo-fi touch. It was very indicative of the time, but of course, this was early Vaporwave where the scene was still trying to discover itself. So what did this album exactly lead to? Well, it further helped establish an aesthetic and set the foundations of a sound which would become so much more popular in later years. Which I guess for an album that was released back in 2011 is quite the achievement. This is an album that if you were to browse our Vaporwave today, you might even find on the front page. That's how clean cut and to the point it is. I think to a lot of people, this album helped set the standards before the essentials even came out. But at this point, with the number of releases that Beer on the Rug had, it was clear that they were trying to curate a sound which could be taken even further conceptually. So they brought an artist which would do just that. Yes, enter Vectoroid. Now, while today she might be incredibly popular with several releases under multiple aliases that have all been well received, back in 2010, she was grinding away like no one else to help define this new sound. So when she brought out a new alias just for Beer on the Rug, people didn't really know what to expect from it. But when they heard it, it was clear that it was a game changer. further continuing on the themes of nostalgia, but further emphasizing and capitalizing on the burgeoning visual aesthetic occurring within the scene at the time. We look at this cover today and think, man, this has to be one of the cheesiest Vaporwave covers you could possibly think of, but back then, it was still fresh and new. In my opinion, I think it's with this album that Vaporwave finally hit its stride with a fresh new sound, and a company with an aesthetic that was resonating with a lot of people. From the music itself, it was clear that Vectoroid was skilled and practiced with her art, and she knew exactly what to do when it came to developing this vibe. From eerie chops and pitch shifting, to using the simplest of cuts for hypnotic grooves. Vectoroid was fine-tuning her skills and on the cusp of something great. Beer on the Rug at this point was making a name for itself as the spearhead of this new online movement, but nothing could prepare Beer on the Rug or Vectoroid for what would happen next. Oh yeah, I mean, you know we're gonna have to get to it eventually when we're talking about this label. Yes, the famous, or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Floral Shoppe. Now, over the years, this album has gained mythical status. To some, people see it as the true birth of Vaporwave, as it was the culmination of all of the previous experimentation from Ferraro to Lopatin and every other Bandcamp album released in between. But somehow, this one hit differently. Maybe it was the fact that it became a huge meme, or that it was legitimately celebrated among critics and listeners alike. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that this album ushered in a new era for the genre.
Macintosh Plus's latest release, along with a few others, are currently being celebrated as the dawning of a brand new genre.
Now, I'll be honest, this album is kind of hit or miss for me a lot of the time. On one hand, I really like the nostalgia that it brings, and when I first heard it, it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. But other days I feel like asking, is this it? Is this all that this album has to offer? Now, I know this is more in part because of age, and the fact that since this became a meme and gained huge mainstream appeal, everyone and their mother tried to emulate the sound, which at the end of the day kind of diluted what made it special. No fault to the original album, of course. Vectoroid was just experimenting and breaking barriers as she went along. Regardless, I do feel that this album doesn't just have a special place in Beer on the Rug's discography, but the Vaporwave scene as a whole. Despite its legacy, though, it definitely set the music world ablaze about the ethics of sampling.
Still, I think if you look at this album with kind of a postmodern lens, I mean, yeah, you could literally take large musical chunks from older songs, sample them, and stretch them out, slow them down, and remix them and loop them in such a way where you're just making new songs.
Some critics like those at Pitchfork thought that it was a stroke of genius, that it was able to recontextualize existing samples and, through the most basic of edits, create an eerie, isolating aesthetic that elicited nostalgia from its listener. While others didn't really see anything beyond lazily cut samples and an album that borderlines the ethics of sampling. But besides this back and forth between critics, it was clear that this album was incredibly successful. So with a strong backlog and the most popular Vaporwave album of all time, Beer on the Rug were on top of the world. But where could they go next? Beer on the Rug were continuing on track with banger releases like Buy Now by Eyeliner and Prism Corp Virtual Enterprises. It seemed for a point that Beer on the Rug could do no wrong and that they had become the foundation of Vaporwave. But it seems they flew too close to the sun. In September of 2019, a thread popped up on the Vaporwave subreddit saying that Beer on the Rug had disappeared. People were confused as to why this was happening. Some assumed that this was because of copyright claims, but even in the most egregious of cases, copyright claims never really shut down labels before. But despite that, Beer on the Rug was gone, and all of its Vaporwave defining pieces. And for a lot of these albums, they had no mirror or any other alternative download source, which means some of these albums might be gone forever. The community was left heartbroken at what was seen as losing a part of its history. Even with Vaporwave being close to 10 years old at this point, the community remembered the label, which essentially kicked it all off. So what can we take away from this near decade-long tale of Beer on the Rug? Well, to Vaporwave fans, the influence of Beer on the Rug is immeasurable. Not just because of the albums that they put out, but the way they decided to curate their sound. At the end of the day, it was their sound which, for better or for worse, defined years worth of Vaporwave material. It created an aesthetic on their label that was so fresh and new and was somehow able to translate to the mainstream. I think a lot of people, when they think of Beer on the Rug, will get tunnel vision and just think of it as the Floral Shoppe label. But to me, I don't think that's anywhere further from the truth. While yes, they did put out Floral Shoppe and it was incredibly successful, you have to take into account the huge catalog of albums and artists that they put out over the years. Artists who didn't just define Vaporwave, but pushed it even further than what was thought of before. And in my opinion, I think reducing this label to just the Floral Shoppe label does a huge disservice to the incredible artists which put loads of work into the genre over the years. There's an archive which has been floating around that's been trying to get mirrors of Beer on the Rug's releases so that their decade-long history and huge influence on the scene isn't forgotten. If you have any of their old releases, be sure to send it over to the guys running the archive. I'll put the link down below. As for Beer on the Rug, they're kind of around. They essentially did a soft reboot with a brand new Bandcamp page clear of all of their previous releases, but they're still putting out experimental work to this day. Now, whether or not they reach the same prominence that they did back in the day, I don't think that matters. They left a huge legacy that almost no one's been able to touch, and I think when people go to listen to their old records, just like with Vaporwave itself, they'll feel a certain nostalgia, and they'll be taken to a time when Vaporwave was in a different place, where passion and enthusiasm and experimentation went rampant, and people were left inspired. Thank you guys so much for listening and watching this video. I'm so happy that I'm able to do this. I plan to do a lot more in not just Vaporwave, but all kinds of music. So if you have any suggestions for kind of artists, genres, albums that you want me to cover, definitely put them down below. And I think you guys will be excited with what I got planned next. So with that being said, thank you so much and have a good day. Morrer do gato botar.